Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yes. I am very excited and a little bit nervous to be here with y'all today. And I am going to be talking to you about a tool that I really love called pry. Yes, pry, yes. So I just wanted to give a little bit of intro about who I am, a little bit of background. It would be completely unlike me if I didn't mention that I was from Pueblo, Colorado, and I am so proud to be from there. Shout out 719. I am a CU Boulder grad. I graduated with my degree in math in 2015. And then I know we were talking a little bit about Turing earlier and how they used to be involved with Rocky Mountain Ruby, but I am a Turing alum. I graduated, okay. I finished in 2019, and for those of you that do not know, Turing was a coding bootcamp in Denver, Colorado. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I am a pry guy. I'm your pry guide for today. And honestly, I have to take it, when I was thinking about this talk and all of the places like where I could start, I really was just thinking that I've been using pry since like the very beginning, and maybe I was indoctrinated at Turing, but I really have never really touched IRB or bybug. I don't really know them like that, but when I was studying at Turing, I was studying backend development, and you know, I see a few familiar faces here who know what it was like to be like in that basement working 60-hour work weeks, like no job. Tensions were very high a lot of the time. But I had a friend there. I met a friend, her name was Stella. And we spent so many late nights in that basement just trying to put two and two together and make sure we could make sense of it all. And whenever we couldn't do that, we would always tell each other, like, baby, you have to pry until you die and just like figure it out. You just have to figure it out. So yeah, I've really been using pry since the beginning of my career, and I've been doing this like a little bit over 5 years. So yeah, I wanted to give just a brief little introduction about what pry is, first of all. I know that a lot of people here have a lot of different familiarity with software development. I'm not sure how everybody else got into it, but I'm sure we all use and know about pry. But just taking it straight from their GitHub, pry is a runtime developer console, and I just spilled all my water. This is literally my worst nightmare. So pry is a runtime developer console and IRB alternative with powerful introspection capabilities. Pry aims to be more than an IRB replacement. It is an attempt to bring REPL-driven programming to the Ruby language. So for me, that was kind of a lot of words, like a lot of big words in there, particularly the runtime developer console bit. And when I was researching this, I had to kind of thank you so much. I had to kind of research a little bit about what those words actually meant. So just breaking it down, runtime, you are able to insert pry into a live application, stopping the execution at any point, and you can interact with the current state of the program. And then as for developer console, what we mean by that is just an interactive environment where we can run code, inspect variables, and navigate through the code base. And kind of tangentially to that, I know we've heard the word REPL before, but I don't know if everybody knows exactly what that means. But REPL stands for read, evaluate, print, and loop. So pry is a REPL, and that is just an interactive programming environment that can take user input, which is the R, the read, evaluate that input, which is the E. They can print it to the terminal, and then loop, meaning that we wait for the next command. So that is just kind of a little bit of a background as to what pry actually is. Now we can talk about getting started with pry. Thank you so much. So getting started with pry, there is really kind of three main gems that I use when I use pry. And it's something that I kind of didn't realize that I use like all together until I started doing the research for this presentation. So generally when you just do your gem install pry, what that does is it gives you kind of like an IRB situation, like a REPL type thing that we were talking about in the previous slide. And, you know, there's not a lot like noteworthy there. And you have like all of the simple commands there that you all know about maybe, which is like ls to list all of the variable methods, cd to navigate objects, and exit to actually leave through the pry. And what I want to do right now is just like a quick little live demonstration. So this is just like a small little app that I built over the weekend to demonstrate this, but you can see here in my gem file here, I have gem pry, prydoc, and pry rails. So now that we know I have those installed, I should be able just to type pry on the command line. And then this will enter us into an IRB situation. So just to give you a brief example on what that looks like 2 + 2 = 4. So we were able to input 2 + 2. It was able to evaluate it and print it to the console. And then we're ready to go again if we need to do something else. So not too much to note there, but kind of something cool to note, I guess. Like you could say x = 2, y = 3, and then, oh, sorry, but do it right. Now, just to show you like that ls command, you can see x and y highlighted in yellow over here. And that was actually something that I didn't really know of until recently. So any variables that you set in your pry session, if you type in ls, it'll show all of what you have access to right on the terminal, which is helpful for me because sometimes I find myself like in these long pry sessions, like all day, and it's just helpful to like know all of the variables that I've like collected over like all of these hours of work or whatever. Maybe that's like not the best thing to do, but it's what I do. So that's just to demonstrate pry like at a very, very basic baseline level, just as like a REPL. So now what I want to talk to you all about is, oh yeah, back here. That was getting started with pry. Now, I am really, really excited to talk to you all about prydoc. So this is one that you might be using that you might not be aware that you're using, but it is a plugin that enhances the documentation capabilities of the pry console. It allows you to view documentation for Ruby classes, modules, and methods directly within the pry session. So what I mean by that is that if I come back here, let me actually Rails C. Let me think here. Amazing. Okay, cool. So what prydoc does is it gives you the ability to, you know, get the documentation straight from your terminal for Ruby source code or really like anything that you have access to like within your app. And this was such a cool feature that I did not know like existed, but I've been using it like for the last couple months, and it's been like a major game changer in my workflow and what I'm bringing to work. So yeah, this is just like the array class, and it brings up like all of the documentation, as I said. If you're the kind of person that likes to have line numbers next to your documentation, it also supports that with the -L option. And there's one other cool little trick. If you give it -D, oh, maybe we won't see that there. Watch, I'll do, nice. Okay, so let me actually show you the difference really quick without the -D flag. So right there, you just see like the actual source code, and it actually tells you like where it's coming from, who the owner is, the method signature, like what that looks like, which is very valuable. There's all of the source code if you care what like that looks like. But if I add that -d flag, then it tells you a little bit like how to work with this particular method. So you can do that literally like on any kind of Ruby Rails method. So yeah, that's one thing that I found was really helpful in my research. And then, yeah. The next thing that I wanted to talk to you all about is something that I actually just demonstrated, but is like very subtle. And with that, I want to talk a little bit about pry Rails. Again, this is another one that you all probably use or have heard of, and maybe you aren't aware that you are. But this plugin is one that integrates with pry with Rails applications, enhancing the Rails console experience by replacing the default IRB shell with pry. So yeah, what that means is that if I had not had installed pry Rails into my application, if I were to go to Rails C, it would by default open up IRB because that is the default that Rails ships with. But now since I have installed this gem, pry Rails, when I do Rails C, we're automatically spun up into a console, and you can note that here. So it says pry, which I think is pretty neat. But when I was researching this, I was kind of like under the assumption that this is like the only thing that pry Rails does. Is that it sets the interactive console as pry, but it actually does a little bit more than that. It supports a couple other methods, which I'll show you now. So if I do actually help, cool. So if you type help into the terminal, it'll actually tell you all of the methods that you have available to it. But two in particular that are helpful for me, actually don't see them. Yes, okay, cool. So if you find this little, if you find this little section, it says Rails, then you get all of these methods with the pry Rails gem. And one of them in particular that I use all the time is this show model method, as well as show routes. And just to kind of give you a visual of that, so show model. So I built like a little diary app, and as of right now, like what I have in there is just a user, a journal, and entries. And I mean, for smaller classes, it's like, or for smaller apps, it's like easy to navigate back to your text editor and just kind of like find the appropriate files or the model classes. But you know, as soon as like we start getting like larger applications with like a lot of different models on there, it's kind of hard and cumbersome to remember like the attributes on whichever model you're dealing with or the associations that go along with it. So something that's like, I'll do that so y'all can see, is helpful is that if you do show model and then, you know, pop in the model name, it'll tell you all of the attributes and all of like the associations that you have with it. But then kind of taking that a step further and putting like all three of these things together, like you could also, oh, I don't think it'll actually work. Show source user. Yeah, okay. So my user class right now is like pretty empty aside from like its validations and its associations. But if I were to put like an instance or a class method like in there, then if I were to do show source and user, then it would show me like the entire file that I'm able to, or that I have like written in my text editor. So there's like no need to kind of like bounce back and forth. And then, like I said, there is also some other cool methods. Show routes is another one that I use a lot. So if you want to do show routes from within the console, it'll tell you like, it's so ugly. It'll tell you like all of the routes that you have like in your application. But sometimes it's not so helpful because you have so many routes. But what is great is that it supports like the grep functionality. So I can, if I just care about like entries. One second. Wow. Did that do it? Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, well, it does do that. It does the grep stuff. I've seen it work before with my own eyes. Cool. So like those are my three main players like when I am debugging with Pry. So I use like the straight up Pry gem and then Pry docs and Pry rails. So those things are really cool. But okay, to be honest, I think I use the Rails console with Pry pretty often, like very often. But I don't know about you all, but when I am debugging locally, it is more often than not, I am using Pry by doing like a binding.pry. And that is probably like the most powerful feature that Pry has to offer me. But when I was kind of thinking about how I wanted to talk about binding.pry, I was thinking like, how exactly does that work? Like, what is binding and what is like this pry method that like goes onto it? So yeah, that was the slide pretty much. So how does it work? How is the execution of the code halted? Well, for that, there is kind of a combination of things at play. It's a combo of control, flow, interruption. So basically when the Ruby interpreter comes up and reads the binding.pry line, or the line that has the binding.pry, then the Ruby interpreter knows to just halt execution, stop, and then you're able to do whatever you want with your pry. And then after that, we have thread and process management. So if you've ever noticed when doing binding.pry, you will notice that the execution context is suspended. It's not terminated. So you're just kind of like hanging there and you're able to interact with the current context. So those are kind of like subtle things on how it works, like high level things, I guess. But if we want to dig a little deeper, we can. So binding object. So binding.pry. Binding is actually an object, which I didn't know. Like it makes sense, but in my head it makes sense, but one of those things I didn't know about. So what is cool is we can kind of put it all together. So we can do show source on, do this actually, binding. So then show source B, and then let's actually get the line numbers and then the RDoc. Oh, maybe not the RDoc. Okay, so this is kind of cool. This is the source code for the binding object. So when you call binding.pry, this is kind of like the first part of that. So you can see here that it instructs the web console to render a console in the current binding without the need to enroll the stack. Raises double render error if a more than one console invocation per request is detected. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Okay, so what that kind of means in regular words is that the binding object captures the current context. You can kind of think of it as like taking a photo of where you are at in your application, wherever you decided to use your breakpoint and halt the execution of code. So at that point, when you call binding.pry, the Ruby interpreter halts the execution, and then the binding object takes like a snapshot of all of the local variables, all of the instance variables, methods, self. It takes a complete snapshot of that and captures that current context. So that is really cool. That is kind of like what is setting us up to be able to play around and like do really cool, neat things. So what happens when we call .pry on that? So pry is called on the binding object that holds the current context. This opens up an interactive pry session where you can access variables in scope, execute Ruby code, call methods, step through code execution. So all of that good stuff. But if you kind of want a little bit of a more detailed explanation, you can use show source here. And then, oh, wait, let me do this. Perfect. Amazing. Okay, cool. So -d worked on that command that time. So yeah, this is what happens when you call the method pry on the binding object. So start a pry REPL on self. If self is a binding, then that will be used to evaluate expressions. Otherwise, a new binding will be created. And then just kind of goes into detail on like how you can use it and then what is actually going on kind of behind the scenes. If you note here on line 27, there's this pry.start and a few arguments passed to it. Pry.start is like another way that you can just start an interactive pry session. Like if you're in IRB and you're not using pry Rails, then you can just do pry start from IRB and it'll pop you into a pry session, which is pretty cool. So nice. That was kind of pry, how it works, how I use it. But something I wanted to also touch base on was pry and process management tools. Yeah, I know most of us are probably working on like larger scale apps that require having some sort of process management tool. And what I mean by this is a tool that is used to run multiple processes simultaneously in development. So this is for apps needing several components running concurrently. So you can think of things like your web server or like something to run your background jobs or do whatever with your JavaScript, Redis, Webpack, Rails.js, Sidekick, all of it. So yeah, we're typically working on apps that are dealing with these process management tools. And one of the more common ones is called Foreman. So Foreman is a manager for Procfile-based application. Its aim is to abstract away the details of the Procfile format and allow you to either run your application directly or export it to some other process management format. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, so it's designed to manage these processes that are defined in a Procfile. But this comes with some caveats when you are wanting to do some local debugging or development and still wanting to use pry, because how many times have you all like ever put like a breakpoint in your code and then maybe you're using Foreman and you go to spin up Foreman and try to pop yourself into your pry session, and then as soon as you like start typing, like all of the output from maybe a job that is running like starts to display itself on your terminal screen, and then all of a sudden the keystrokes that you're making like aren't registering correctly and things are like broken and very scary and you can't do anything. So that is like I would say like a huge deterrent from wanting to use pry or being able to have that functionality. Usually what I do in like these scenarios is I will go to like my Procfile dev, and in each terminal in my in separate windows in my terminal, I'll run each process separately. And then with doing that, I'm able to do like a Rails.js and I'm able to hit my binding.pry, but that is a lot of work, very cumbersome. And it's actually something that I wanted to talk to you all about here in this Rails issue. Here, there's a lot of conversation on it. There's a lot of conversation. It was written by DHH, and it's important for the release of Rails 8, which was last week. So there's been a lot of comments on this issue. But basically what he goes on to like outline here is kind of the problem that I was just describing in the previous slide. Basically, you know, you get like the job output rendering the terminal like not useful, and then the keystrokes are all weird. We know why this happens. It's probably because of the underlying processes running due to Foreman. And yeah. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, cool. So this issue, yeah, describes the scenario we were just discussing, written by DHH. And in this issue, he kind of goes on to detail a solution. And the solution involves creating a custom bin dev script that starts Foreman in the background while keeping the Rails server as the main active process in the terminal. And this would be helpful because then the debugger can still work directly as Rails runs in the foreground. And I also just kind of want to note really quick that the issue that he makes here and that he's describing is not specified to pry. This also happens with debugger as well. And I think that's what he's talking about in here. So yeah, he goes on to outline like a potential solution, but this comes with a few drawbacks. And one of those is that the web process duplication, since the proc file typically defines a web process, but we shouldn't be doing so because it's already being handled by the Rails process. And one other thing that he goes on to outline in here is that they need to fix is the fact that Foreman usually outputs timestamps, which has a tendency to clutter up the logs, and maybe that can be disabled. So yeah, and then one other interesting point that he makes in here is that this is important for Rails 8 because Rails 8 is shipping with solid queue. And solid queue is going to be the default job process, which will require a background process to manage job queues. So the solution that DHH goes on to describe should work for solid queue as well as Foreman, where the Rails server runs as the primary process and the solid queue process runs in the background. So yeah, I know that was like a lot of words, but I just wanted to share like some funny like anecdotal stuff before I get back to my presentation. There's somewhere in this issue where DHH goes on to explain how it's not a deal breaker for him that the job output clutters up like the terminal so long as the keystrokes work and everything renders as you expected. But for me, that would be like a huge deal breaker and something that would push me away from using Foreman. But something that is even more interesting is that somewhere else down here, someone goes into, well, why do we have to use Foreman? What about Overmind? It's somewhere in this long conversation thread, but I can talk to you a little bit about Overmind because it ties into what we were talking about with the process management tools. So Overmind is a process manager for proc file-based applications and utilizes tmux. With Overmind, you can easily run several processes from your proc file in a single terminal. So just kind of touching on that, Overmind extends Foreman by using tmux and allows managing processes in separate tmux panes for better control. This is different than Foreman because what Overmind is suggesting is that in your terminal, you will be able to kind of tease apart different panes which relate to different processes. Whereas in Foreman, you only have the option to use one pane for all of your processes, which makes it kind of unusable. So yeah, that is kind of why I prefer Overmind over Foreman, because with Overmind, if you want to go ahead and do your binding.pry, you can do so as you would with Foreman. But if you go back to your terminal and just type in Overmind connect, then it will open a separate pane with your binding.pry, and you can use it as expected. It's really nice. Something else that I thought was funny was like, what is tmux? I don't know what that means. Oh. And then I looked to see what it means, and it said it's a terminal multiplexer, which sounds made up. Like, I can't believe I'm here talking to y'all about terminal multiplexers right now. Like, that is so crazy. But basically what that means is it lets you switch easily between several programs in one terminal, detach them, and reattach them to different terminals. So it's very valuable. I suggest maybe taking a look into it. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Something that I used that was pretty cool was this tool called MERP or something like that. MARP, it's MARP. But basically what it did was it took I typed all of my slides out in Markdown, and then it made all of my Markdown into slides. But basically why I wanted to bring that up is that maybe I can post this somewhere for people if they're interested, because it has like all of the documentation for everything, if you all care. So yeah, let me know. Thank you.